Okay, I'm Walter Reed, and I live in Wilmette, Illinois. I'm an immigrant because I was born in northern Bavaria in the city of Würzburg, but actually I didn't live there. My family and I lived in a small village in the same area in Franconia, and the name of the village is Main-Stockheim, Main-Stockheim. It's called Main-Stockheim because it's on the Main River, Main. And I was born into a Jewish family in this small village, which had about 1,100 inhabitants at the time, a farm village. Most of the people were day laborers or farmers. And the Jewish people were either wine merchants or cattle dealers, for the most part. And they all got along extremely well. Our family name was Rindsberg, R-I-N-D-S-B-E-R-G, and I was Werner Rindsberg, W-E-R-N-E-R, and I was born in 1924, lived in Main-Stockheim until I emigrated, and my father and mother were distant relatives, actually, and they both hailed from another Franconian town. But my father started the wine business in about the early 1920s, and he actually got into the business because his father, Moritz Rindsberg, had founded that business in 1899, I mean. And my father succeeded him. I didn't know my grandfather because he died before I was born. And my father conducted a wine business, which means he refined and made wine in huge quantities, and then went by train around a whole wide region to sell it primarily to professional people. And when I was born in 1924, things were pretty bad in the country. Nevertheless, my parents had two more sons. My brother Herbert was born in 1926 and Kurt in 1928. And to get ahead of the story just a little bit, my parents had the courage and the foresight to send me away to Belgium in 1939. Unfortunately, they and my brothers could not get out, and in 1942, soon after the mass murder started, all the Jewish population from my region that was left over were deported to southeastern Poland in the area of Lublin and murdered in the spring of 1942. So for my immediate family, I'm the only survivor. The story is a little bit more complicated than that, because things got bad in the village where we lived only gradually. When Hitler came to power in 1933, I was just 9 years old, and I was then going to a local small parochial school, Jewish grade school, and my teacher was Herr Friedman. And by sheer coincidence, Herr Friedman was the uncle by marriage of Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger used to come to our village to visit his aunt, and once in a while we played soccer together. I have reminded him of that a few years ago, and neither he nor I remember that we did, but other people say we did. So this was a sort of a non-important little village where life went on. But soon after the Nazis came to power, certain local people joined the SA, the Sturmabteilung, which was the brown shirts, the local blue-collar guys who were Nazi adherents, and things got pretty bad. Our first wake-up call, in spite of the fact that we knew that things weren't going to be very good, came on Kristallnacht. I was 14 years old. And that day, my father and I were grabbed by brown-shirted thugs, put on a truck, and taken to the nearby town of Kitzingen, which was the county seat. And we were put in jail with all the other Jewish men from that whole region. 3 days later, the Nazis decided that they really made a mistake in arresting a 14-year-old, so they sent me home. But my father and all the other male prisoners of Kristallnacht in our region were sent to Dachau, to the concentration camp. And my father was there at least 4 or 5 weeks. When he came home, he was a broken man. His health was terrible. He looked about 20 years older than he had when he was arrested, and he never talked about what went on there. But that experience and the whole situation in Germany led my parents to use some contacts they had and to find a way to get me out of the country, at least to get me away. And as a result of their efforts and their great courage in sending their oldest son away, at age 15 in 1939, I was sent to Belgium, where a women's rescue committee had gotten permission from the Belgian government to bring in almost 1,000 Jewish children from Austria and Germany. And I was the lucky one of those. This committee distributed us in Brussels and in Belgium to different families and to different orphanages, and I was in one in the city of Anderlecht, which is a suburb, blue-collar suburb of Brussels, and I was in a orphanage boys' home with about 40 other boys ranging in age from about 6 years old to 16. And we were there from 1939 to 1940. When the Nazis invaded the Western countries, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, the rescue committee managed to get us in the last minute, 48 hours before the German army marched into Brussels, onto one of the many refugee trains. And we were loaded on a freight train, almost 100 children, boys and girls, from 2 different refugee homes. And we went off into the unknown. We're on that train for about 4 days, meandering all through northern France, central France, eventually down into southern France, near the area of Toulouse. And there we were unloaded and were taken to a tiny, tiny village of about 50 population up in the hills south of Toulouse, a place called Seyre, S-E-Y-R-E. And in that place, we were put into what looked like a barn that had nothing in it, no heat, no furniture, no bathrooms, no running water, no lights. And almost 100 of us, ages about 6 to 16, were living in that place all during the summer of 1940. The French, of course, surrendered within 6 weeks, and then we were under the Vichy French regime, so-called, which was headed by an old general, Marshal Pétain, and we sort of existed in that place for something like 10 months, and in between
Did they put you to work?
We were out in the countryside, and the older boys worked on local farms. The French farmers in that area, all very small and not very wealthy farmers, needed labor because their sons and their male family members had been in the French army. Many were taken prisoner by the Germans and used as prison labor in Germany, weren't returned, so they had a shortage of labor. And the older teenage boys, myself included, were very welcome labor force to the local farmers. In turn, that helped our colony of almost 100 children because food was scarce, then rationed. And because we were working at local farms, we had access to potatoes and other things that could be furnished to our colony in return for our labor. It was not a very comfortable or very fortunate existence because everything was rationed. Pretty soon the Vichy French government put in place anti-Semitic legislation and persecution of Jewish people, and particularly those who were immigrants or who had not lived in France for a long time. So our life there, while we were safe for the second time, our life there was very precarious. And eventually, as winter came, with no heat, no running water, no facilities, no amenities. Literally our health and our life were in jeopardy. And at that point, one of the Belgian women who had also fled from Brussels to southern France made a connection for our colony with a Swiss Children's Aid Society that had moved into Vichy France to help wartime refugees and especially children. And as a result of the efforts of Madame Goldschmidt was her name, as a result of her efforts to connect us with the Swiss people, the Secours Suisse aux Enfants, Swiss Children's Aid Society, took over our camp. They ran several others as well. And as a result of that, we all obtained Swiss godparents in Switzerland who sent postcards, who sent chocolates, who sent other things to the children. And the Swiss organization provided powdered milk, cheese, all things that we didn't have, and eventually even clothing, so that we were finally under the protection of yet another rescue organization. The winter of 1940 was extremely tough. It was the roughest winter to date in the 20th century, and we had no heat and we were in terrible shape. We also had an awful lot of disease and health problems because of the poor nutrition, and we were sleeping on straw. We had no beds, no furniture. Pretty soon lice invaded children's hair, and we had a very, very precarious situation. Nevertheless, we had at least escaped, again, the Nazi persecution, and were, in relative terms, somewhat safe in southern France. By the time the winter was coming to an end, these Swiss people decided we needed to be moved to a different place, and they found an abandoned so-called chateau, a really run-down, unoccupied country estate called Chateau de la Hille, H-I-L-L-E, and we moved to that particular place in the spring of 1941. I was among the 20 or so boys and girls who went ahead of the main contingent of children, and we had to dig latrines, and we had to provide water supply, etc., before the colony could move. I was very fortunate because all of the siblings of my mother, 2 brothers and 4 sisters, had lived in a Franconian village where the Nazis were especially nasty, and they wanted their village to be Judenrein, free of Jews, early on in the Nazi days. As a result, they harassed the population even more than was the case in my village, and therefore all of the siblings of my mother who lived in that village, managed to get out before it was no longer possible. And they lived in the New York City area, and they managed in 1941 somehow to get me a visa to the USA. And I was one of the few, there were only about 20 of us, who managed to get to the USA from southern France out of the 100 children. I was one of the lucky ones, got a visa, came to New York on Labor Day 1941, just 90 days before Pearl Harbor, and lived with my relatives in New York. I went to school at night at Erasmus High School. Had not gone to high school before because of all the interruptions since we left Germany, and worked as an apprentice tool and die maker all day during the day in Manhattan. My English teacher at the evening high school was a gentleman named Bernard Malamud. Bernard Malamud later became a prize-winning novelist. At that time, he was just a young man and hadn't written anything yet that anybody knew about, but I still have the great reports that he signed in my English class that he taught. Obviously, 90 days after I came to the USA, Pearl Harbor was bombed. USA entered the war, and I well remember the war effort as it began. I was, when I came to the USA, 17 years old. 2 years later, in early 1943, I was drafted into the Army at age 19. And something that was not usual in the Army in those days. My actual military duties were very close to what I had been doing in civilian life. I'd been a tool and die maker apprentice, and the Army classified me as a bulldozer mechanic, which is pretty close to what I'd been doing. And that was unusual. Usually they put you into something that was not related to what you knew. And I was trained in that and shipped overseas in March 1944 to England. When we got to England, they transformed me into a combat engineer. Those are the people who went in ahead of the infantry. And the reason was they had enough bulldozer mechanics, but not enough combat engineers. So in June 1944, when we invaded in Normandy, I and my companions were loaded on a ship, and we landed in Normandy a week after the invasion as replacement troops, and advanced toward the center of France, ended up south of Paris after Paris was liberated in August 1944, and we camped there when I found out that the U.S. Army was really looking for German speakers because they were short on personnel who could interrogate prisoners. I volunteered for that, was trained for 2 weeks in a suburban area of Paris, and then assigned to the 95th Infantry Division, which had just landed in France and was advancing toward the German Lorraine area. And a team of 7 of us, all German speakers, were attached to the 95th Infantry Division, which moved into battle right after we joined them. And our job then was to interrogate German prisoners newly taken at the front, primarily about tactical information. I did that until the war was over in May 1945, and then was assigned to the Counterintelligence Corps, which was a group of, again, German speakers who had been trained for this and who were working with the military government in the effort to denazify German government and academia. One of the things that I was assigned to do at age 21, having never set foot on a college campus, was to denazify the faculty of the University of Marburg, one of the famous German medical schools and universities. And indeed, our job was to try to assure that the real Nazis would no longer be in government and in academia. No matter what we did, the people who came after us, the Americans who came after us, didn't know the culture, didn't know the history, knew very little about Nazis. And as a result, in spite of our efforts, eventually many of those Nazis who had been in hiding and whom we had detached from their jobs got back in. But that's not important. Life had to go on. When I came back to the United States and was discharged in February 1946, I first worked for a brief time for one of the then budding airlines in New York, but decided I wasn't going to get anywhere in my life if I didn't get a university degree. I'd been inclined for some time to want to be a journalist, so I managed to get into the University of Missouri School of Journalism, from which I graduated in 1949, and from then on fashioned a career in public relations, from which I retired officially in 1989, then ran a consulting business, international consulting business, for another 10 years or so, and then now I'm completely retired. That's sort of the story of my life. I married late. I was 45 years old when I married my wife, to whom I've now been married 41 years. And we have 3 sons who are scattered across the world, literally. And life is good. Unfortunately, it wasn't until a year or 2 after the war ended that I got concrete information that my family, my parents and my 2 brothers, were murdered in Poland. I did not know that at the time. In fact, in July 1945, I went back to Mainz-Stockheim to find out what happened to them. And the only thing the local people really knew was that they had been sent to a labor camp in the East. And that was the fiction that the Nazis were telling their own people and to the Jewish victims when they carted them away. So that is sort of the story of my life. I did not have any connection with the children and teenagers with whom I was in Belgium and France after the end of World War II. From 1946 on, I put all this stuff behind me and started a new life. It's not that I couldn't bear to think about it, I just decided the future is more important than the past, and I wasn't going to let Hitler make one more day of my life miserable, so I just put it all away. It wasn't until 1997, when we were on a family trip to France, that I proposed to my wife and sons we should go back to the area near Toulouse where I had been during the war. And we did. And when we went there to Serres and to the Chateau de Lailly, we found out for the first time what really happened to my friends and colleagues of that time after I left for the United States. And the story of their fate and what they endured and what they had to cope with after I left is just as gripping and as dramatic as any other Holocaust story. Because I was very touched by this, and because I got reunited with many of my erstwhile companions and was then retired and had the time and the interest, I've become the curator, coordinator of all the survivors. And in 1998, my wife and I organized a reunion in Chicago of those who were living in the United States. Those in other countries really didn't care to come. So we had a dozen of the survivors and their families to come to Chicago for 3 days and reminisce and reunite. The event was so gripping for everybody that they all said, we've got to have another one. And I said, yes, but it will have to be in France, and you'll have to give me a couple of years to organize it. And in the year 2000, my wife and I organized another reunion, this time at the site of our places in Serres and in Lailly. And at that time, 30 survivors came from all over the world with their families, about 75 people altogether. Local government people from France participated in this reunion, and out of that grew all kinds of other activities, and also the desire to maybe tell the story of the children of Lailly in a very graphic form. And for that reason, I have written a book about the history of the children of Lailly with a lot of research and a lot of documentation from private sources, from archives, and found out all kinds of things, some of which I've narrated here that other people really didn't and don't know about. So that literally I've come full circle, and I'm now totally involved with the story of World War II and what's happened. I've had the privilege of participating in many commemorations in France, in Germany, with German present-day people, and even in Poland at the sites where the deportations took place, and where 3 years ago a monument was erected by the current citizens of my home area. 80 of them made a pilgrimage to Poland, and my wife and one of our sons and I participated in that, in the commemoration of the victims. So my story is one not only of being persecuted by the Nazis, but also with present-day involvement that has to do with reconciliation, with recognition that the people who now live in the areas where all these crimes were perpetrated are just as normal and as caring as anybody else. And that's really, to me, the most fascinating part of this story. That is, that human beings have overcome the past, can overcome the past, and can look to the future.
Wow. How did you meet or where did you meet your wife? I was just curious.
I met my wife on a blind date, long delayed. One of my closest friends, then in Chicago, now no longer alive, who had very poor taste in women, kept trying to urge me to have a date with my wife, and I didn't trust his judgment. So it took quite a lot of efforts and some desperation to say, okay, maybe I'll call her up. and the rest is history.
Was it love at first sight?
No, it wasn't love at first sight, but it didn't take long.
But you met her in Chicago.
Yes, we were living about 3 blocks away from each other, and that really made possible getting together because my friend Jack, who recommended that I should meet her, I just didn't trust, and I wasn't going to go 20 blocks to find somebody that he recommended. But when I found out she only lived 3 blocks away, we had a blind date, and it went from there.